A 2-year-old girl vanished right in front of her own house, and for many years, everyone believed it was just a simple missing child case with no mystery behind it. But the story was never that straightforward. A series of suspects were placed under investigation, from local residents with strange behavior to a mysterious nomadic community that had been spotted near the scene. This is the disappearance of a child too young to call for help, and every adult connected to the case carried secrets that are hard to explain. Many people once believed the little girl might have been taken in by someone against the family's wishes, that her disappearance wasn't necessarily a crime. But I don't think so, and I'll explain why. Down in the description there's an entire playlist of missing persons cases that were solved after many years, and I'm sure you'll want to listen because those are stories about persistence, about justice, and about finding the truth in darkness that lasted decades. Before we dive into this shocking true story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you love these journeys to find forgotten justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. Alabama in 1965 still had the slow, closed-off rhythm of the American South, where small communities depended on and trusted one another almost absolutely. The suburbs of Mobile at that time were quiet rows of wooden houses, front doors often left unlocked, children free to run and play on the lawns, and adults rarely worried about crime because almost everyone knew each other's faces and believed bad things only happened somewhere else. It was in that seemingly perfectly safe setting that the Turner family lived and raised their 2-year-old daughter Mia. Robert Turner, a mechanic at Mobile Shipyard, was a calm, hard-working man who devoted all his free time to his family. His wife Evelyn Turner worked shifts at a seafood restaurant near downtown and was a careful, sensitive mother who noticed even the smallest changes in her daughter. Mia Turner was only 2 but very lively. She loved dragging along her little wooden doll with wheels and usually played right in the front yard within her parents' sight. June 17, 1965, unfolded like any other day, with no warning of anything unusual. That afternoon, Robert was fixing a part on his old Ford in the garage, while Evelyn prepared a light meal in the kitchen before her evening shift. Mia was running back and forth in the yard with her doll, occasionally stopping to look at her dad, and then running toward the low fence in front of the house. Everything was familiar, exactly the daily routine the Turners had kept for months. But that very familiarity made even the smallest change hard to notice. Early that afternoon, a brown sedan appeared at the end of the street, driving slower than normal for the very light traffic in the area. A few neighbors saw it but paid no attention. Strange cars occasionally passed through looking for the main road. The car paused for a few seconds near the intersection, then continued on, leaving no obvious reason for suspicion. Meanwhile, Evelyn had just put the kettle on the stove, glanced out the window, and saw Mia still there, playing near the front steps. Confident her daughter was safe only a few steps away, she turned back inside to grab a towel to dry her hand. The time she was away from the front door lasted less than 1 minute. When Evelyn stepped back outside, the front yard was as quiet as before, but Mia was no longer where she had been. The little girl's wooden doll lay tilted near the walkway, as if suddenly dropped. Evelyn instinctively called her daughter's name but got no answer. She hurried down to the yard, looked around the grass behind the bushes, then ran to the fence. Still no sign of her child. Robert heard his wife calling, immediately left the garage, and searched the property with. In just minutes, their initial confusion turned to panic, when every place Mia could have reached on her own had been checked with no result. A few neighbors heard the calls and came over to help, checking the back of the house, both sides of the street, and shouting the little girl's name. In the chaos, one neighbor remembered the slow-moving brown sedan from earlier, but could only describe the color and the silhouette of the person in front. There was no solid information to guide the search, and time was passing too quickly. Barely 10 minutes after realizing their daughter was gone, Evelyn was close to collapse, and Robert knew searching the immediate area themselves was no longer useful. He ran inside, picked up the phone, and dialed the Mobile Police Department's emergency number, reporting that his 2-year-old daughter had vanished without a single trace. When Robert Turner's call reached the Mobile Police Department dispatcher, the duty officer immediately flagged it as urgent. The victim was 2 years old, and the time since last seen was extremely short, meaning every minute mattered. Alabama did not yet have a dedicated missing child alert system in 1965, but rapid response protocol for cases involving young children was still followed, and within less than 2 minutes, the nearest patrol unit was dispatched to the Turner home. The first police car arrived roughly 12 minutes after the call, while the family and neighbors were still searching in desperation. The two officers asked everyone to stop moving around the yard, so they could identify any initial evidence that might remain. They noted the location of the dropped toy near the walkway, marked the area where Mia was last seen, according to her parents, and scanned the ground for footprints or skid marks. And on the dry dirt and thin layer of leaves near the fence, they found several adult shoe prints that did not belong to anyone in the family. At the same time, 2 tire tracks on the curb in front of the house showed compression different from the Turner's car or any vehicles that regularly parked nearby, suggesting a strange vehicle had stopped briefly. These details were documented by hand, according to standard scene processing procedure of the era. After the initial physical assessment, the lead officer began collecting statements from direct witnesses. Robert and Evelyn took turns recounting what they were doing in the minutes before discovering Mia was gone, their accounts affected by stress, and making exact timing hard to pin down. The closest neighbor, Miss Carter, confirmed seeing a brown sedan driving slowly down the street, pausing briefly, then leaving, but he could not make out the license plate or how many people were inside. Others in the neighborhood heard no cries for help or unusual noise. Some only remembered that the area was normally so quiet that the strange car stood out as potentially important. All statements were recorded and cross-checked on the spot for consistency or contradiction. In this early stage, police had to consider the possibility that the child wandered off on her own, as that was common in missing child reports at the time. However, after comparing statements with the scene, that possibility was quickly ruled out. Mia was only 2. She could not have traveled far in such a short time without leaving clear traces, and the surrounding area had been searched by adults almost immediately. The absence of small footprints leading away from the yard in any logical direction further supported the conclusion that Mia did not leave on her own. Instead, the adult shoe prints and unfamiliar tire marks directly in front of the gate strongly indicated a third party had been present at the exact moment of the disappearance. Officers also noted that the window between Evelyn looking away and discovering Mia missing was less than 1 minute, far too brief for a 2-year-old to leave the yard and vanish completely from everyone's view on her own. Combining the situation, physical evidence, and witness statements, police shifted their assessment from child wandered off to disappearance involving intentional third-party action. This meant the case was no longer treated as an accident, but as a potential criminal matter, especially serious because it involved a young child. The commanding officer requested additional units to expand the search area and cordoned off the scene to prevent further contamination. In the initial report sent back to the station, the incident was classified by the standards of the time as a missing person case, most likely involving an outsider who approached and removed the side using a vehicle. That early classification laid the foundation for the investigation's direction, with abduction established as the primary focus from the very first minutes of the case. Officers continued the critical early step of gathering every related statement to create a seamless timeline from the last confirmed sighting of Mia to the moment the family realized she was gone. Robert described his work in the garage and the periods he wasn't looking toward the front yard, but panic affected his memory, so he could only give rough estimates. Evelyn clearly remembered going into the kitchen, putting the kettle on and looking for a towel, yet the actual time those actions took was longer than she subjectively felt. Small adjustments in the couple's accounts made a big difference when pieced into the timeline. Neighbor Mr. Carter added the detail about the brown sedan driving slowly, pausing briefly, then continuing, though he could not pinpoint the exact time. Some nearby residents recalled an unusual engine sound, while others remembered an oddly quiet moment. Putting these scattered details together showed that all witnesses were recalling events while emotionally shaken, leading to inconsistencies. Officers had to cross-reference every account against the physical evidence at the scene. The adult footprints near the fence and fresh tire marks on the curb proved an outsider had been present very close to the moment Evelyn returned to the door. Based on the average time needed for the actions Evelyn described, investigators calculated there was only a very narrow window in which someone could have approached and taken Mia. During analysis, police determined the perpetrator's most likely action window lasted no more than a few minutes. The sedan seen earlier was placed at the center of the timeline because its direction matched the physical traces at the scene. The road leading to the main part of town allowed a quick getaway without drawing attention. Tracking dogs losing the scent where it met the main road further supported the theory that the vehicle turned onto heavier traffic, making follow-up difficult. Combining statements with scene data helped identify possible escape routes. The shortest route to the main traffic artery became the focus, as the distance from the Turner house to that turn could be covered in dozens of seconds by car. The lack of direct witnesses to the actual departure forced police to rely entirely on logical time windows, allowing them to estimate how far the car could have traveled in the next. Although some statements weren't perfectly aligned, investigators were still able to construct a reliable timeline starting from the last sighting of Mia, followed by the brief period the Guardian looked away, the appearance of the unknown vehicle, then the family's discovery and call to police. This timeline became the crucial foundation for narrowing the scope of suspicion, guiding the appropriate investigative direction, and definitively ruling out the child wandering off. Thanks to the relatively tight frame, the team could map potential perpetrator movement and prepare to move into deeper analysis based on routes, suspicious vehicles, and the behavioral pattern inferred from the initial disappearance sequence. The evidence gathered from the scene and the initial timeline prompted investigators to immediately expand the search to the entire area surrounding the Turner home within a 1-mile radius, as every child missing case hinges on the ability to respond quickly in the first few hours. Police mobilized additional patrol units, coordinating with local rescue teams and neighborhood volunteers to sweep all high-risk areas, starting from the closest points and gradually expanding outward in concentric circles. The main road leading out of the residential area was prioritized and searched first, followed by the waterfront areas near a tributary of Mobile Bay, where the wet, dense terrain could conceal traces if the child had wandered off or been placed there by someone. The sparse woods behind the row of houses, an area locals rarely visited due to low-lying ground and thick underbrush, was searched in a grid formation to ensure no low spots or clearings that could hide a child were missed. Construction sites nearby, mostly unfinished house frames, material yards and equipment repair areas, were also thoroughly checked because of the risk of blind spots. As the search teams moved farther from the residential area, K9 units were brought in to track Mia's scent using her clothing and a toy. The dogs followed a path along the small road in front of the Turner house, across the lawn, then straight toward the main road, the exact direction where officers had previously spotted fresh tire marks. At the intersection of the small road and the major thoroughfare, the dogs completely lost the scent. This abrupt break strongly supported the possibility that Mia had been placed in a moving vehicle, rendering scent tracking nearly useless from the moment the car left the neighborhood. During the search, authorities found no additional physical evidence, such as clothing, other toys, or signs that the child had fallen or left on her own 2 feet. The waterfront areas showed no slide marks or small child footprints. The sparse woods revealed no fresh signs of movement. The construction sites had absolutely no traces connected to a 2-year-old. This series of observations further solidified a key conclusion for police. Mia did not leave the house on her own, but was carried away from the scene quickly. In the risk assessment model applied to missing young children at that time, the absence of scattered evidence in the area indicated that the case did not resemble a child accidentally wandering away from a caregiver, but rather fit a scenario involving active third-party intervention. When combined with the dogs stopping dead at the main road, investigators leaned heavily toward the hypothesis that the perpetrator used a vehicle to remove Mia from the area. This also aligned with witness statements about a brown sedan seen near the time of the disappearance. To test this possibility, police continued scanning connecting roads from the Turner neighborhood to other parts of Mobile, examining routes that allowed easy escape from view and locations where a vehicle could stop unnoticed. The completion of the 1-mile radius search without new evidence clearly shaped the direction of the next phase. There was no longer any basis to focus on the possibility of the child wandering off, while every existing indicator pointed to an abduction carried out using a motor vehicle. The initial conclusions that Mia was most likely removed from the scene by vehicle shifted investigators' focus to identifying the car that had appeared near the time of the disappearance. Officers began compiling every description of the suspect vehicle from witness statements, noting even the smallest points of agreement. Although no one saw the license plate, Descriptions of a dark brown color, a four-door sedan body style, and a slightly low rear end helped narrow the search to several common models in the region. The team compiled a list of Chevrolet, Ford, and Oldsmobile models in similar colors registered within the three-county area of Mobile, Baldwin, and Washington counties, where the perpetrator was most likely to live or pass through at the time of the abduction. From the state's vehicle registration database, the initial list contained more than 40 matching vehicles, which was then further reduced by eliminating cars that were inoperable, in repair shops, or owned by households with solid alibi. The remaining list was examined with a focus on the owner's histories, particularly cases involving unusual travel patterns, sudden address changes, or ties to frequently traveled border areas. Some owners were cooperative and provided clear itineraries for the day of the incident. Others could not offer convincing explanations or gave inconsistent statements, prompting police to flag their files for further review. During this screening, investigators noted traffic police intelligence about a small religious nomadic group that had passed through the Mobile suburbs roughly 1 week before Mia's disappearance. The group called itself Pilgrim's Light and typically traveled in multiple older vehicles, including several dark-colored sedans that matched witness description. Initial data showed the group had no fixed residence, staying only briefly before moving on, making it difficult to verify their exact activities during the relevant time frame. The presence of Pilgrim's Light opened an entirely new investigative avenue, since their nomadic nature and convoy travel could reduce the likelihood of local residents noticing individual vehicles. Police saw a potential link between the group and the sedan involved in the disappearance, as their travel route overlapped with the main road connecting the Turner neighborhood to surrounding areas. However, investigators continued to pursue the local resident angle and did not rule out the possibility that the suspect vehicle belonged to someone familiar with the area. Two distinct investigative tracks began to take shape. One focused on the registered owners from the list, including stable residents around Mobile, and the other centered on vehicles associated with Pilgrim's Light, requiring the tracing of a constantly moving group's route. No decision was made at this stage on which track to prioritize, but the existence of two separate possibilities helped structure the next phase, in which both local and nomadic factors had to be examined independently, yet in parallel to avoid missing critical evidence. Narrowing down the suspect vehicle provided the foundation for the next step, constructing a behavioral profile of the perpetrator based on the case's specific characteristics. A method still quite rudimentary in the mid-1960s, but nonetheless helpful in identifying the most likely suspect groups. Based on the rapid disappearance, the extremely short window between the guardian looking away and the child being discovered missing, and the presence of a motor vehicle, the team identified possible motives: a desire to take and raise the child, to transfer the child to someone else in an illegal private arrangement, or an impulsive act by a psychologically unstable individual. Factors such as no signs of struggle at the scene, no disturbed objects, and the child being removed quietly, quickly, and without noise made the abduction for rearing purposes or transfer to another party motives more plausible than direct harm motives. This preliminary behavioral profile helped police focus on three primary persons of interest among the vehicle owners and nearby residents. The first was a woman living alone, who owned a brown sedan registered 2 years earlier, had a history of infertility, and had inquired about children in the neighborhood a few months prior. The second was a man previously noted for unusual behavior around town playgrounds, who drove a car matching the witness description. The third was a married couple living not far from the Turner home, regarded by neighbors as reclusive, whose statements contained some inconsistencies about being home at the time of the incident. All three were placed in the high-priority group and subjected to cross-checking of their whereabouts when Mia vanished. Alibi verification followed the standards of the era, relying mainly on statements, neighbor K-worker, family confirmations, and any available time-stamped receipts from local stores or services. The woman living alone stated she was home at the time, but no witness could confirm it. However, police found no suspicious activity from her after the disappearance, and her car was reportedly parked in place all day according to a neighbor across the street. The man with the prior unusual behavior provided a receipt from a store several miles away, but the timestamp did not fully rule out the possibility he had been in the Turner neighborhood earlier. For the couple, some of their statements conflicted, but no physical evidence linked their vehicle to the scene. When these suspects were measured against the previously established timeline, police found that none of the three perfectly fit the tight window the perpetrator needed to approach and remove Mia. The adult shoe print found near the fence did not match the footwear size of any of the three. Additionally, the tire marks in front of the Turner home did not match the tread patterns of the three vehicles under scrutiny. These mismatches gradually eliminated each suspect from priority, without formal exoneration, causing investigators to refocus on elements that had not yet been fully verified. Although Pilgrim's Light had been mentioned in the suspect vehicle analysis, the group's constant movement, lack of fixed address, and absence from local registration records led officers, following 1960s investigative thinking, to quickly remove them from the primary suspect list. The preliminary profiling conclusion deemed the nomadic group unlikely to be involved due to lack of direct evidence, while investigators prioritized suspects with clear local addresses. Dropping Pilgrim's Light early at this stage was considered reasonable under the professional standards of the time, but it later proved to be one of the decisions that narrowed the investigation and caused broader perspectives to be missed, especially since the abduction was executed with speed and discretion that none of the three main suspects could satisfy according to the timeline and vehicle trace comparison. The deadlock in matching suspects and vehicles to the timeline made the investigation team vulnerable to being pulled into signals that seemed valuable but were ultimately irrelevant. Starting with a report from Biloxi, Mississippi, where a resident reported seeing a confused little girl wandering alone on the beach area. The girl was approximately Mia's age, and was said to resemble her based on a brief description, forcing the Mobile police to send a team for an in-person comparison. The geographic distance between Mobile and Biloxi was not great, and was consistent with a perpetrator's ability to travel quickly by car, so the report was taken seriously. However, upon contact, investigators confirmed that the girl in Biloxi was the child of a local family, and the misunderstanding stemmed from her being separated from her parents for a few minutes. Despite the clear exclusion, handling this tip consumed significant time and manpower during the most critical phase. Before the Biloxi lead was fully resolved, the Mobile Police Department received another distracting piece of information. A man walked in and claimed he was the one who had kidnapped Mia. This was a situation police had to approach cautiously, as false confessions during that era were not uncommon and often stemmed from personal motives or mental instability. The man's statement contained numerous contradictions, including details about location, timing, and the vehicle he described that did not match evidence at the scene. When cross-checked against recorded times of activities he claimed, police quickly spotted the inconsistency. He could not have been in the Turner neighborhood at the time of the disappearance. Additional evidence from coworkers and neighbors confirmed he was elsewhere all that afternoon, leading to his confession being completely dismissed. Though eliminated quickly, the incident still significantly disrupted the analysis of actual suspect files, diverting a portion of resources into investigating a completely false lead. While investigators were still dealing with these reports, another misdirection continued to draw misplaced attention. A childless couple living near the Turner area, who had ended up on the suspect list because neighbors mentioned their years-long expressed desire for a child that had never been fulfilled. Although their statements about being home on the day of the disappearance contained minor inconsistencies, police found no physical evidence or any trace linking them to the scene. Moreover, their vehicle did not match the description of the brown sedan and showed no unusual travel history. Nevertheless, due to the lack of new leads, investigators still spent considerable time digging deeply into this angle before ruling it out. Focusing too long on these three dead-end avenues, the girl in Biloxi, the false confessor, and the childless couple, drained resources significantly and slowed the pursuit of other possibilities. An already difficult investigation became even more unfocused as false reports continually interrupted the analysis of real data. Having to dispatch officers to locations outside Mobile, verify unrelated statements, and handle internal suspicions, forced many officers to pause more critical tasks, such as reviewing the activities of the Pilgrim's Light nomadic group, or vehicles traveling major routes on the day of the incident. Gradually, the investigation veered away from its original focus, identifying the brown sedan and its driver, to chasing noise that provided no real value. In a context of limited analytical technology and insufficient personnel to split into multiple directions, these red herrings substantially reduced the effectiveness of the crucial first days of the investigation, the most vital period in any child abduction case. The prolonged series of false leads, combined with the absence of genuine clues, caused the Mia disappearance case to gradually stall. In the initial weeks following the red herrings, investigators returned to re-examining the scene, vehicle owner lists, and suspect files, but uncovered no new data capable of opening the next analytical path. All physical evidence from the scene had already been collected and compared without yielding additional information. The brown sedan never reappeared in citizen reports, and no one in the area reported anything further out of the ordinary involving a child in the immediate aftermath. Police continued cross-checking suspicious vehicles against monthly registration lists, but every car that fit the description was verified and eliminated. Vehicles belonging to key suspects, despite odd details in their statements, could not be linked to any previously found physical trace. For out-of-area vehicles or those no longer registered, the necessary data to track them down was missing, halting that line of inquiry. Expanded canvassing in neighboring towns also produced no progress, as most businesses, gas stations and stores of that era did not keep records in a way that could assist an investigation. Additionally, both witnesses and neighbors gradually became unable to provide new detail. Memories faded over time, and initial descriptions that were already vague became even harder to rely on. Some witnesses could no longer recall exactly when they saw the sedan, while others wavered between subjective impressions and what actually occurred. When police returned for follow-ups, most responses were shortened versions of original statements that offered no breakthrough. People living farther from the Turner area also had nothing of value to report, since the main road had low traffic volume, making it nearly impossible to pinpoint a specific vehicle. Nearly 2 years passed, with every piece of evidence circling back to a dead end. No suspect matched the inferred behavior, no vehicle fully matched the traces at the scene, and no new statement carried enough weight to reopen a line of inquiry. Every possibility considered in the early phase had been checked multiple times without result. The investigative team, constrained by the technological limitations of the era, could not extract further information from other sources, because there was no identification technology, no vehicle movement storage system, and no federal alert mechanism for missing children. By early 1967, after reviewing all investigative documents and finding no basis to continue expanding in any direction, Mia Turner's disappearance was deemed no longer suitable for active investigation. The Mobile Police Department prepared paperwork to transfer the file to cold case status, meaning the investigation was suspended but all data would remain fully preserved for reactivation if new leads emerge. Related documents, statements, sketches, vehicle lists, search reports, were sealed and moved to storage per regulations of the time. In the final report of this phase, the case was briefly summarized: no progress, no identified suspect, and no ability to rule out any scenario involving the child being taken by an unknown person. Moving the file to cold case status marked the official pause of the investigation, leaving a huge void in the Turner family's hopes and an unanswered question about Mia's fate for years to come. The case being placed on cold case status did not make the Turner family give up hope, and for the entire following decade they continued searching for Mia in every way available to them. Robert and Evelyn contacted police departments in nearby towns, sent letters to charities, churches, and hospitals, hoping for any information about an unidentified child who might match Mia. Each year local newspapers occasionally mentioned the disappearance again, maintaining a certain level of awareness, but still yielded no new data. Reports of unidentified children surfaced sporadically across the American South, and whenever a description seemed close, the family asked police to compare. However, all were confirmed not to match. One case involved a little girl found in a religious community in Mississippi, but medical records proved she was born locally. Another case in Florida initially raised the family's hopes due to physical similarity, but age and birth records did not match. Nonetheless, each comparison drained the Turners' time and emotions, as they clung to even the smallest possibilities. In an era of limited technology, the Mobile Police Department had no means to reopen the file using modern analytical approaches. There was no DNA database, no national missing children registry, no image matching technology, and no annual case review procedures as later became standard. If a child had been given a new identity or taken to another state, authorities had virtually no way to trace her. This made the chances of finding Mia during this period almost entirely dependent on luck or the sudden appearance of a new witness, neither of which happened. Tips from neighboring states, such as Georgia, Louisiana, or Tennessee, occasionally reached Mobile, mostly from local agencies, discovering children without proper documentation. But when details like age, medical marks, and basic identifying features were compared, all were ruled out. Social service centers in various states also forwarded information about informally adopted children, but none fit the 1965 timeline, especially regarding age. By the mid-1970s, the frequency of such tips had dropped sharply. In Mobile, younger officers who joined after the incident only knew the story from old archived files. Some residents who had helped search in the early days had moved away. Others' memories had faded to the point of being unable to contribute anything useful if the case were reopened. The Turner family, though still keeping Mia's picture in their home and in community prayers, gradually had to face the reality that every tangible lead had been exhausted. The disappearance no longer appeared in the press as it once had, except on anniversaries of the incident, and in community life, newer stories gradually replaced older memories, causing the case to slip from public attention. With no new technology to exploit, no new witnesses to add, no signs to follow, and no updates entered into the cold case file, the Mia Turner case quietly faded into obscurity. Throughout this period, the file recorded no progress whatsoever, only reflecting the Turner family's persistence in stark contrast to the investigative system's helplessness at that time in the face of its tools and methods' limitations. While the case in Mobile gradually faded into obscurity, a completely separate development was taking shape in Shreveport, Louisiana, where a little girl approximately 3 years old began appearing in the community under the name Sarah Coleman. There was no official record of when the child arrived in town. All that was known was that the Coleman family, a couple active in a small religious community, began raising her as their own around the late 90s. That community had loose ties to the Nomadic Pilgrims Light Group, which regularly traveled through multiple southern states and occasionally stopped in the Shreveport outskirts on an irregular cycle. The connection between the Colemans and the group was not clearly defined, but it was strong enough for local residents to describe them as part of the same religious circle. When local authorities conducted routine checks under the city's child registration programs, the first irregularity was noted. Sarah had no valid birth certificate issued by Louisiana or any other state. The Colemans explained that the child had been placed in their care by an acquaintance within the community, but could not provide supporting documentation. Information about her birth year, birthplace, and prior medical history was incomplete, recorded only from verbal accounts rather than official records. When Sarah was taken to a local clinic for routine examinations, doctors also discovered the absence of basic vaccination records. These gaps did not trigger immediate intervention because child welfare standards at the time were far more lenient, but everything was flagged for future review if additional data emerged. Additionally, the Coleman family's own household registration records contained numerous inconsistencies. There were discrepancies in the dates they claimed to have begun caring for Sarah. The date listed in church records differed from the one they provided during census surveys, and no formal notification had ever been sent to child welfare agencies regarding the acceptance of a non-biological child. The religious community they belonged to itself operated in a closed manner, sharing little information with outsiders, creating an environment that civil authorities found difficult to penetrate. As Sarah grew up, people who knew the Colemans began noticing contradictions between how the couple described the adoption process and reality. For example, at one point they said Sarah was a distant niece, sent to them due to family hardship, yet months later they told others they had taken her from a woman in the community who could no longer care for her. These inconsistent stories did not raise public suspicion at the time, but later became critical pieces of information in retrospect. Sarah, meanwhile, grew up as a natural part of this small community, completely unaware of the gaps in her identity. However, through documents recorded by local agencies at the time, Mounting signs indicated she was not the Coleman's biological child. No photographs of Sarah from earlier periods. No confirmation from any church member of a blood relationship, and no one outside the couple who knew exactly where she had come from. In the closed religious setting, the sudden appearance of a new child caused little disruption, but from the perspective of official record, the lack of basic documentation and inconsistencies regarding her origin formed a chain of red flags that, at the time, could not yet be linked to any missing child case. Sarah grew up in that environment, carrying an identity formed without clear origin records, and her presence became a natural part of the Coleman family, even though local agencies quietly kept files noting the paperwork gaps as a case that did not match any valid adoption process. The ambiguity in Sarah Coleman's paperwork gradually became something she herself noticed as she entered her teenage years, especially when she had to provide personal information for school or medical facilities. During an administrative records check in 1979, Sarah discovered that the birth date listed in the family's household registry did not match the one on the only vaccination certificate the Colemans had ever provided. When she asked, she received only vague answers, such as the papers had been filled out wrong long ago, or the priest had made a mistake when redoing them. This inconsistency made her want to examine the remaining documents more closely, but the family consistently avoided the subject or gave excuses to prevent her from seeing them. While continuing her schooling, she began asking teachers to let her view her school records and realized that most of her information had been entered based on the family's verbal statements, with no original supporting documents attached like her classmates had. Some fields were even left blank or marked unknown. These details made Sarah feel isolated, because nearly every other child had complete information about birthplace and medical history, while she did not. The older she got, the more she wanted to understand what had caused those gaps. She tried talking to adults in the religious community who had known the Colemans for years. A few responded evasively, saying she had been sent here during a difficult time or brought by people who were traveling. Although those statements offered no confirmation, they hinted that the Colemans might not actually be her original family. When she tried piecing together everyone's accounts, Sarah realized no two stories fully matched regarding how she had arrived in Shreveport. Some said she arrived when she was 3, others remembered 4, and a few claimed she appeared suddenly after a visit by a traveling group the community had once provided with food. These inconsistencies made her doubts about her origins grow sharper. Another incident pushed her further toward seeking answers. While helping organize the church's storage room, Sarah saw her name on the membership list, but with no parental information listed the way other children's records were kept. That column was completely blank, stating only cared for by the Coleman family. This deviated from the standard record-keeping of the era, which typically tried to establish each member's origins, especially for children. That anomaly reinforced that her background story was anything but straightforward. From these accumulated questions, Sarah decided to dig deeper into the few people who had dropped even vague clues. She approached an elderly woman in the community who had repeatedly hinted that Sarah wasn't like the other kids here. In one conversation, the woman said Sarah had been brought from very far away, and that everything happened so fast, no one knew every detail. Though she did not name a specific place, she casually mentioned far to the east, suggesting the direction of Alabama or Mississippi. That offhand remark became the first real clue suggesting Sarah had not been born in Louisiana. Sarah started writing down the scattered pieces she collected. Unclear year of arrival in Shreveport, administrative paperwork lacking verification, the foster family's consistent avoidance, and the fact she was said to have come from a direction that matched routes taken by Pilgrim's Light members. Taken together, these small fragments formed a blurry but compelling picture. She may have been brought to Shreveport informally, and was very likely not the Coleman's biological daughter. The peak of her suspicion came when she traced old religious records and saw descriptions of Pilgrim's Light members often traveling with children of unclear relation. That detail matched the late 1960s timeframe when the Colemans began raising. Another coincidence was an older community member once saying she arrived right after the caravan from Alabama stopped by, making it impossible for Sarah to dismiss the possibility that her origins were tied to that state. The scattered elements gradually converged into one major question. The identity of Sarah Coleman may have been built on years of missing information, and she was becoming the first person actively asking questions about the truth, questions no one around her had ever wanted to answer clearly. Sarah's growing doubts about her identity in Shreveport coincided with Alabama beginning to pay closer attention to long-dormant missing persons files, leading to the decision in the mid-1980s to establish a dedicated cold case unit. The unit was created to re-examine old cases that had stalled due to earlier investigative limitations or lack of technology, including the Mia Turner case filed in. When the file was transferred to the new team, investigator Karen McMillan, an experienced analyst of old case structures, was assigned to reevaluate every document from the beginning. Her report showed that the 1965 file contained a wealth of valuable information, but had been hampered by the era's methods, including inability to track interstate vehicle movement, absence of identification databases, and over-reliance on unstable witness statements. By recompiling timelines, statements, physical evidence, and subsequent reports, Karen identified several significant investigative errors, dismissing the Pilgrim's Light group too early without evidence, failing to follow their vehicle and not re-evaluating child witness statements that described details consistent with a child being taken by a woman. The report also noted that the attention given to certain local suspects was disproportionate to how well they actually fit the timeline, causing early misdirection. When reviewing previously discarded leads, Karen paid particular attention to Pilgrim's Light's presence in the area immediately before and after the disappearance, combined with reports describing the group using multiple older vehicles, including dark sedans. Although 1960s documentation could not confirm involvement, their frequent cross-state travel and loose organizational structure had made tracing them nearly impossible at the time. However, with the cold case unit's new tools, Karen's team began retrieving records about nomadic religious communities over the past 2 decades, gathering administrative reports, religious membership lists, local police logs, and any surviving old vehicle registration. Numerous scattered documents from Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama revealed that Pilgrim's Light had appeared multiple times in various locations in the late 1960s and early 1970s, often without formally registering when passing through small towns. This matched the possibility they had been in Mobile during the period Mia vanished. Karen continued reviewing old witness statements and noticed details previously undervalued, such as Carter's description of the driver possibly being a woman, aligned with characteristics of individuals in Pilgrim's Light recorded in scattered reports. She also noted similarities between descriptions of several female group members in Louisiana religious records and witness descriptions from Mobile in 19. As the unit expanded its collection, the cold case team sent information requests to police departments that had previously encountered Pilgrim's Light. Several provided old reports of stopping a religious caravan in the late 1960s that noted the group traveling with children of unclear relation. That information quickly became seen as the key to reconnecting previously fragmented data in the old file. At the same time, witnesses who had lived near areas where Pilgrim's Light had stopped were reconsidered for fresh interviews to see if any overlooked details might surface. Although most memories had faded over time, a few still recalled the image of a woman regularly tasked with caring for children in the community, matching informal descriptions from the Mobile file. The pieces of information were gradually linked, not as direct evidence, but as the foundation for concluding that the Pilgrim's Light lead needed to be restored to central focus rather than remain dismissed. Karen concluded that the 1965 disappearance could still be solved if a clear connection were found between this nomadic group's movements and a child recorded as appearing in Shreveport around the same time with no origin record. The re-evaluation returned the case to active investigation after nearly 2 decades dormant in Alabama's cold case archives. Karen McMillan's discoveries about the presence of Pilgrim's Light during the period Mia went missing opened the next line of verification, cross-referencing the group's travel route with the time when Sarah, the name Mia was then using, first appeared in Shreveport. Religious records, old vehicle inspection reports from police stations that had contact with the convoy, and accounts from local residents showed that Pilgrim's Light traveled through Alabama in mid-1965, then continued through Mississippi before reaching Louisiana. These travel markers closely matched the time frame when Sarah was first recorded in the Coleman community, even though no official records existed. While comparing documents, Karen noted that Shreveport was one of the group's first independent stops in the late 1960s, and the timing aligned with Sarah's approximate age when she began living with the Coleman family. The overlap in routes and timing provided the foundation for examining a deeper connection between Mia and Pilgrim's Light. At the same time, the cold case unit began searching for witnesses who had encountered this religious convoy during the years it was on the move. Several residents in Mississippi and Louisiana described the group as usually having a middle-aged woman who took care of the children traveling with them. This woman was often seen with the young children and was regarded as their caretaker or guide in the group's internal activity. When Karen compared their descriptions with the description of the suspicious driver in the 1965 file, she noticed striking similarities: slender build, long hair tied back neatly, and usually dressed in plain single-color clothing. Although the images could not be treated as conclusive evidence, the match in appearance and behavior significantly increased the likelihood that this woman was connected to Mia's disappearance. To further strengthen the link, Karen focused on analyzing Pilgrim's Light's travel routes year by year. The group did not follow a fixed schedule and frequently changed routes based on manpower needs, religious purposes, or weather. Scattered reports showed they operated along interstate routes connecting Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. This unpredictable movement explained why tracking them during Mia's disappearance had been so difficult, and also raised the possibility that they had left Alabama too quickly for police or the community to notice any trace. Karen also noted that the group only stayed in populated areas for short periods, and typically did not record information about the children traveling with them, making it extremely complicated to trace the identity of individuals in the convoy. To clarify the connection between Sarah and Pilgrim's Light, the investigation team began reviewing the Coleman family's administrative records, the people who had raised Sarah from a young age. Their files contained numerous inconsistencies: no hospital birth certificate, no adoption notification sent to child welfare agencies, and no evidence confirming that Sarah was biologically related to them. The church documents they provided also conflicted regarding when Sarah was brought into the community. This ambiguity supported the hypothesis that the little girl had been taken in through an informal channel, possibly via Pilgrim's Light, or an individual in the group. While re-examining old church member lists, Karen discovered a notable coincidence. Some internal Coleman community records mentioned the arrival of a strange woman from an Eastern pilgrimage group at the exact time Sarah was brought into the family. Although the information was too fragmented to identify her, the appearance of this woman matched descriptions given by witnesses in Mississippi of a female member of Pilgrim's Light. This led the investigation team to focus on the female figure described across multiple sources: the child care woman in the nomadic group, the person present near Alabama at the time Mia disappeared, and the individual likely involved in bringing a child to Louisiana through no official channel. Although her identity remained beyond immediate confirmation, the appearance of a woman matching the description across states, combined with the lack of transparency in how Sarah became part of the Coleman family, allowed Karen to narrow down the probable scenario: Pilgrim's Light's presence in Alabama in 1965, and the appearance of a child of unknown origin in Shreveport shortly afterward, could no longer be regarded as random coincidence. As a result, the case began moving into a phase where the two worlds, the missing person file in Alabama and the history of a nomadic community that had quietly appeared in several southern states during the same period, could finally be connected. Cross-referencing Pilgrim's Light's route with Sarah's appearance in Shreveport provided sufficient grounds for the Alabama cold case team to take the most critical step in the entire process: biologically determining Sarah's identity. DNA testing technology began being used in criminal investigations in the mid-1980s, and this was the first time the Mia Turner case had the chance to be approached with scientific methods rather than relying solely on witness statements, as it had for the previous 2 decades. With cooperation from Louisiana authorities, Karen McMillan submitted a request for Sarah's biological sample for analysis. Sarah, who had long suspected her own origins, agreed to provide a blood sample without hesitation, seeing it as her chance to finally get answers to the questions she had carried since adolescence. The sample was sent to a laboratory working with the cold case unit for DNA analysis. Using the RFLP technique, the only method available at the time, capable of analyzing human genetic structure in a criminal investigation context. In parallel with collecting Sarah's sample, the investigation team contacted the Turner family and explained the possible link between the 1965 disappearance and a young woman in Shreveport. Even after more than 20 years, Robert and Evelyn immediately agreed to provide their own biological samples. This was the first time they had hope, based on scientific evidence, rather than scattered tips or uncertain witness descriptions from the past. Their blood samples were collected according to proper procedure, sealed, and sent to the same laboratory handling Sarah's test. The lab performed DNA analysis using the RFLP technique, employing restriction enzymes to cut DNA into fragments, and comparing the band patterns between Sarah and the Turners. The process took many days and required a combination of manual work and direct observation on electrophoresis gels. Throughout the waiting period, the cold case team carefully avoided making any statements, but all the data gathered up to that point had already strengthened the likelihood that Sarah was directly related to Mia Turner's disappearance. When the results came back, the DNA bands from Sarah's sample showed a complete match with Robert and Evelyn's samples in a direct lineage genetic pattern. This match could not be explained by chance or distant kinship. The degree of similarity fell within the near absolute probability threshold for a parent-child relationship. The scientific report confirmed that Sarah Coleman was in fact Mia Turner, the child who vanished from her front yard in Mobile in 1965. The cold case unit immediately drafted an official identity confirmation document, updated the missing person file, and formally notified the Turner family. After more than 20 years, the biggest question in the file, Mia's disappearance, finally had an answer backed by undeniable biological evidence. Mia was recorded as a 1965 missing person victim who had been found alive, ending the longest-running whereabouts unknown case in Alabama's cold case archives at that time. The DNA results confirming Sarah was Mia Turner forced the administrative systems of both Alabama and Louisiana to initiate a comprehensive identity restoration process, something the decades-old missing person case had never anticipated. The first step was to correct all of Mia's identification information in the legal system. The name Sarah Coleman was recorded as the identity used during the period of unknown origin, but her legal identity had to revert to Mia Turner based on her An identity amendment document was issued, confirming that the use of the name Sarah Coleman stemmed from circumstances beyond the victim's control and was neither voluntary nor lawful. In parallel with restoring her identity, Louisiana authorities had to review all paperwork related to the adoption process within the Coleman family. Previously gathered documents had already revealed irregularities, but now they were examined at a legal level. No birth certificate, no guardianship decision, no report filed with child welfare, and no confirmation from any medical facility regarding the time Sarah was taken in. All of this proved that bringing Mia to the Coleman family had not followed any legal adoption procedure. This review also clarified that the Coleman couple had not engaged in deliberate fraud to adopt a child. They had simply accepted the child from an unknown person or group in a context of incomplete information. However, the unintentional nature did not eliminate legal responsibility for using dishonest documentation throughout the process of submitting information to authorities. An investigation into the origin of how the child entered the foster family was launched to determine who had directly handed Mia over to them. Numerous former witnesses from the religious community were interviewed, and the results showed that a strange woman had appeared at a community gathering with a convoy that locals described as having characteristics similar to pilgrims' life. She was said to have brought a child in need of a home to the Colemans, but provided no paperwork whatsoever. Although her specific identity could not be determined, this testimony reinforced the conclusion that the nomadic group played a role in bringing Mia to Louisiana. Louisiana authorities then compiled all the inaccurate information provided over 2 decades, from the incorrect birth date and unclear household registration status to inconsistent religious records, and issued a legal correction decision. The Coleman family was required to sign a statement acknowledging that all previous documents for Sarah were invalid, and to surrender related records. Although they faced no criminal charges due to lack of evidence that they knew the child's illegal origin, they still had to accept the record corrections under child welfare supervision. With Mia's legal identity restored, Alabama coordinated with Louisiana to prepare reunion procedure. This was not merely an administrative process, but a phase requiring extreme care, as the victim had lived more than 20 years under a different name and in an environment completely different from her biological family. The child welfare file was reopened to assess Mia's psychological and social condition, ensuring the reunion would not cause her harm. These preparatory steps laid the necessary foundation for Mia to finally meet the Turner family again under her true identity, an identity that had been interrupted for more than 2 decades, since she disappeared from her front yard in. The process of restoring Mia's legal identity was complete, paving the way for the most important step, arranging the reunion between Mia and the Turner family after more than 2 decades apart. To avoid emotional overload or putting pressure on the victim, agencies in Alabama and Louisiana agreed on a neutral, quiet, and private location. A conference room at a welfare agency in Mobile was chosen because it had enough space for psychological support if needed and was close enough to where the Turners lived, so they would not have to travel far during this sensitive time. Before the face-to-face meeting, the investigative team and welfare representatives conducted an in-person identity verification to confirm that the DNA results matched the real person. Items from when Mia was little, photographs, descriptions of birthmarks, and initial medical records were brought in to compare with Mia, who had lived her entire life as Sarah and had never known about her real childhood. Identifying features such as the shape of her ears, the location of a birthmark, and facial contours were confirmed to match, further reinforcing the accuracy of the DNA test. This verification was both technical and symbolic. For the first time in 22 years, Mia's true identity was confirmed, not only by science but also by physical presence. When they entered the room, the Turner family came face to face with the daughter they had lost when she was just 2 years old, now a grown woman. No one in the room could have prepared for that moment. Robert, who had never let go of hope even after the case was closed for 2 decades, recognized traces of his little girl in Mia's eyes. Evelyn, who had spent years grappling with grief and guilt, could barely stand when she saw her. And Mia, though she had no memories of them, still felt an inexplicable connection. The moment the 3 of them touched, simple, quiet, was the moment a thread that had been severed when their lives were torn apart in night. After the identity verification, legal representatives formally handed over the paperwork to Mia and the Turner family. The documents included the record of identity restoration, administrative decisions from Louisiana and Alabama, and the full invalidation of all documents issued under the name Sarah Coleman. These papers were not only legally significant, they marked the end of the long period of uncertainty that had defined Mia's childhood and young adulthood. For the first time in over 20 years, the Turners were legally restored as the guardians of their biological daughter. Accepting Mia back was not just a legal act, it carried profound emotional weight and put an end to a search that had lasted nearly a quarter century. The reunion did not instantly fill every emotional void or answer every question, but it closed the most important chapter of the journey. Mia was no longer the nameless missing child in an Alabama cold case file. She had returned to her family as a real person, with her real identity and an undeniable confirmation. This also officially ended the phase of searching for the victim and shifted the story to the remaining issues. Things that even a complete reunion could not erase. But at least the biggest question about Mia Turner's fate had finally been answered. The successful reunion and confirmation of Mia's identity immediately made another question urgent. Who took her from Mobile? And to answer it, the Alabama Cold Case Unit launched a new investigative phase focused entirely on Pilgrim's Light, the itinerant group that had been in Alabama around the time of the disappearance. The first step was to compile a full list of every member ever recorded or mentioned in scattered documents across multiple states over 2 decades. The list was built from religious records, highway patrol vehicle inspection reports, social service reports, and civilian statements. However, because Pilgrim's Light was a constantly moving community with no formal registration and frequent changes in membership, the list was both incomplete and difficult to verify. Still, investigators were able to narrow down several individuals who had been in Alabama during the summer of 1965 and later appeared in reports in Mississippi and Louisiana. At the same time, investigators cross-referenced vehicles known to belong to the caravan with descriptions of the brown sedan. Some older vehicles in late 1960s traffic stop records had similar color and body style, but there were no consistent maintenance or registration records to clearly link any of them to the car seen in the Turners' neighborhood. Tracing the caravan's route was also difficult because Pilgrim's Light frequently borrowed or traded vehicles internally, making it nearly impossible to pinpoint ownership at the exact time of the incident. Despite this, detectives interviewed everyone they could find who had ever been connected to the group. Some former members were located in various religious communities across the South and West. When asked about the structure of Pilgrim's Light in 1965, they described a self-governing group of people committed to a nomadic life, with no administrative record-keeping. A few confirmed the existence of a woman who took care of children in the caravan, but all said they did not know where she came from, when she left, or whether she was still alive. These descriptions matched Karen's initial assessment, but were not specific enough to identify the perpetrator. To clarify further, the team analyzed Pilgrim's Light's travel patterns over the years, and compared their routes to locations connected to Mia's appearance. This showed some overlap in time and place. The caravan was in Alabama at the time of the disappearance, in Mississippi a few weeks later, and in Louisiana around the time Sarah began being cared for in Shreveport. However, the overlap only reflected the overall journey of a group. It did not point to any specific individual responsible. No physical evidence preserved from 1965 could be compared with later data, and the caravan's habit of swapping vehicles made it impossible to definitively identify the brown sedan. Surviving witnesses remembered very few details, and memories had faded or become distorted after more than 2 decades. Many former members of Pilgrim's Light had long since moved on and could provide nothing of legal value. After months of reviewing records, conducting interviews, and cross-checking documents, the investigators could not find direct evidence identifying who took Mia from Mobile. A criminal case requires clear proof, fingerprints, eyewitnesses, a confession, or physical evidence, but none existed or remained available. Although the collected data strongly suggested Pilgrim's Light was involved, no individual within the group could be held legally responsible. The investigation reached a dead end. The perpetrator was likely someone from the caravan, possibly the woman who brought the child to Shreveport, but there was not enough evidence to name anyone. Finding Mia had solved the mystery of the victim's fate, but the identity of the person who took her remained beyond the reach of law enforcement. The impasse in identifying the individual responsible for taking Mia from Mobile forced the cold case unit to shift to an overall evaluation of possible hypotheses that could explain the crime, based on what was known about Pilgrim's Light, their travel pattern, and the irregularities surrounding Mia's delivery to Shreveport. The first hypothesis centered on the possibility that the sect had an organized practice of bringing children into the group for internal purposes, such as raising them according to their beliefs, or maintaining a young membership. Some nomadic groups of that era routinely accepted children from unclear sources, viewing it as salvation or expanding the spiritual family. While Pilgrim's Light was not confirmed to have done this systematically, rare accounts indicated they often traveled with children whose biological connections were unknown. Under this theory, taking Mia may have been a decision by a small subgroup within the caravan, not intended to cause harm but to place the child in an environment they believed aligned with their doctrine. The second hypothesis focused on individual action, particularly the woman several witnesses described as the caravan's child caregiver. If she was in Alabama at the right time, she might have approached Mia when the opportunity arose, and taken the child on her own without involving the rest of the group. In itinerant communities, members did not always closely monitor one another, and independent action by one person was not uncommon. In this scenario, the motive could have been a desire for a child of her own, a need to care for children, or a zealous belief that she was saving a child from an environment she deemed unsuitable. The third hypothesis considered the existence of an illegal interstate adoption network, operating during that period, using nomadic or religious communities as cover to move and transfer children outside the legal system. Groups like Pilgrim's Light, with their constant movement and lack of registered membership, could have served as conduits for people wanting to adopt informally. Although there was no direct evidence of such a network, Mia's lack of paperwork, the inconsistencies in the Coleman statements, and the appearance of an unknown woman in Shreveport kept this hypothesis from being completely dismissed. When comparing the 3 hypotheses, the cold case team assessed plausibility based on available data. The organized sect hypothesis fit the caravan's loose structure and travel patterns, but lacked historical evidence that they actively took children. The individual action hypothesis matched witness descriptions, and the fact that Mia ended up with a specific family rather than a communal group, but there was insufficient data to identify the woman. The illegal adoption network hypothesis reasonably explained the paperwork gaps and the secrecy around the transfer, but no concrete evidence of such a network in the region in 1965 existed. Each hypothesis had strengths and weaknesses, and none was strong enough to become a definitive conclusion. Ultimately, investigators concluded that the case most likely involved Pilgrim's Light, or an individual associated with the caravan, but the extent of involvement and the motive could not be determined from existing record. With no direct witnesses, no surviving physical evidence, and no confessions or internal documentation, the file could not name a specific perpetrator. The case therefore retained a major gap in its most critical part: who took Mia and why. Identifying Mia and recovering the records after more than 2 decades did not merely close the fate of a victim once considered permanently missing. It also created a profound impact on the legal system and investigative practices in Alabama. Law enforcement agencies recognized that the errors in the early stages of the case, over-reliance on witness statements, the absence of vehicle tracking systems, and the lack of protocols for managing missing child information had derailed the investigation and left the case stalled for years. From that realization, Alabama began changing its approach to child abductions. Rapid response procedures were rebuilt with stricter standards, more rigorous standards, requiring investigators to canvass and document all information in the shortest possible time, while keeping multiple investigative avenues open instead of narrowing them too soon. Requirements for preserving crime scenes, collecting physical evidence, and mapping suspect movement were updated to meet the new standards. In addition, the state implemented the Family DNA Registry, a voluntary DNA registration program for families with missing or unidentified children. Mia's case proved that DNA was the only factor capable of breaking a decades-long deadlock, and starting in 1987, the registry became a critical tool for cross-identity matching, minimizing the risk of children having their identities swapped undetected. At the same time, the case raised questions about how to oversee unregistered, nomadic religious communities that kept no membership records. Although Alabama did not impose coercive controls, the state began requiring groups passing through its territory to provide basic information about the number of people, the number of children traveling with them, and the vehicles used. This was not intended to restrict religious freedom, but to ensure authorities could screen information when incidents involving minors occurred. Local governments also began coordinating with neighboring states to create data-sharing networks that could track caravans, showing unusual changes in members or vehicles. Simultaneously, cold case file storage procedures were significantly improved. Files were no longer passively archived; they had to be digitized and categorized by time period, crime type, and evidence status. Every file was required to include an investigative summary so new detectives could quickly grasp the entire prior investigation without reading hundreds of pages of notes. New regulations also mandated periodic case reviews instead of waiting for fresh leads. Finally, Alabama began adding specialized training for investigators handling missing children, focusing on nonviolent abductions, non-traditional motives, and cross-state movement patterns, the very factors that had made Mia's case so difficult. These training courses emphasized analyzing community structures, group behavior, and informal adoption practices in order to reduce the chance of repeating the mistakes of the. Thanks to the Mia Turner case, Alabama gradually developed a more proactive, precise legal and investigative system, capable of handling complex disappearances that earlier technology and investigative thinking could not resolve. The legal changes and official reunion marked the biggest turning point in Mia's life, opening a long reintegration period as she returned to her biological family after more than 20 years living under a different identity. Coming back to the Turner home, Mia faced a reality that was both familiar and alien. She was the biological daughter of 2 people she had no memory of, and they, despite having searched for years, now had to learn to accept an adult woman instead of the 2-year-old girl who vanished. Reintegration therefore happened slowly, and required time for both sides to rebuild a family bond severed for far too long. Robert spent much of his time helping Mia understand family history, relatives, and memories of life before 1965 that he and Evelyn had preserved through photographs, objects, and story. Evelyn, who had carried the heaviest grief, approached Mia with caution and empathy, aware that the mother-daughter relationship had to be built from scratch. For her part, Mia experienced a mixture of curiosity, disorientation, and unconscious guilt over the years of separation. Even though she bore no responsibility for her circumstances, she still worried about not meeting her biological family's expectations. While reintegration was underway, the story with her adoptive family could not simply be left behind. The Colemans, who had raised her throughout childhood and adulthood, remained an important part of Mia's life. Although they no longer had legal rights once her identity was restored, 2 decades of emotional bonds could not be erased. Mia chose to stay in touch with them, but the boundaries were redrawn to fit the new reality. They were no longer her legal parents, yet they remained the people who had raised her with genuine care. This transition inevitably brought emotional conflict as Mia tried to balance gratitude toward her adoptive family with the need to rebuild ties with her biological parent. Legally, the identity Mia Turner was fully restored, while Sarah Coleman was retained in records only as the name used during the missing period, with no further legal validity. Mia had to update every personal document, driver's license, bank records, educational records, medical files. Each corrected document was a step toward solidifying her true existence, confirmation that she no longer lived in an identification void. However, returning to her original identity also brought major challenges. Mia had to restructure the life she had built for 20 years as Sarah. Adapting to a new name, new history, and new relationships required constant emotional and cognitive adjustment. She had to learn about her own past while continuing her present life, often feeling pulled in 2 directions. In the early return period, Mia struggled with memory milestones she didn't share, and with community expectations from people who had sympathized with the Turners for years. She had to learn to handle local media attention, neighbors' curiosity, and questions she herself couldn't answer. Mia's psyche fluctuated between relief at finding her true roots and disorientation at having to rebuild her identity from the ground up. Counseling sessions helped her gradually understand that having 2 pasts, biological and adoptive, was not a choice between them, but a matter of learning to integrate both. Through that process, Mia began creating a new space for herself where she acknowledged both lives, one as Sarah, tied to the Colemans, and her life in Shreveport, the other as Mia, tied to the interrupted roots, and the journey to reclaim herself after 22 years away from home. Mia's return did not only transform her family, it instantly drew media attention across Alabama and spread to many southern states where communities still held vague memories of the 2-year-old who disappeared from her yard. Newspapers large and small covered the story extensively, emphasizing that a seemingly unsolvable case had been confirmed through modern DNA technology. The story quickly became a regional media highlight, not only because Mia was found alive, but because it raised broader questions about how society handled missing child cases in the. Many articles re-examined the original files, pointing out investigative errors that contributed to the deadlock, prematurely ruling out Pilgrim's Light, over-reliance on inconsistent statements, lack of vehicle tracking tools, and no federal coordination mechanism. The press stressed that with today's technology and protocols, the case would not have dragged on for 22 years. These discussions continued to push the public to re-evaluate past missing child systems that were unstandardized, lacked proper storage, and had poor interagency linkage. Media interest created a powerful ripple effect, raising community awareness about the importance of early reporting, scene preservation, and demanding clear information from nomadic religious groups or other distinctive communities. Mia's story became living proof that a single early oversight can disrupt an investigation for decades. Child protection organizations began using the case as a textbook example in awareness campaigns, stressing that missing children are not just a crime issue, but a community responsibility where everyone must observe, report, and assist. Some groups incorporated the story into training materials as an illustration of how danger signals can be missed in seemingly safe environments. Numerous workshops and child safety courses in Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi cited the Mia Turner case as a key case study, showing the consequences of initial misunderstandings and delays in analyzing leads. At the professional level, the case was quickly added to new investigator training programs as a model example of the importance of timeline analysis, keeping multiple hypotheses open early, and using DNA to break cold case deadlock. Police academies and behavioral analysis units referenced the case as a real-world example of how nomadic community movement can complicate traditional investigation. Additionally, cold case researchers regarded Mia's case as a landmark in Southern judicial history, highlighting the clear difference between two eras of investigative capacity, one reliant on direct observation and testimony, the other on biological evidence and federal data. Academic papers and professional reports published in the late 1980s cited the case as a turning point in investigative development, when DNA technology could not only identify perpetrators but also restore victim identity after decades. As a result, the Mia Turner case became one of the most influential examples in driving systemic change in Alabama's justice system. Not because a perpetrator was caught, but because the most important thing was recovered: the truth about one child's fate, and a profound lesson in how society must protect its most vulnerable. Intense media and professional interest could not change the fact that the Mia Turner case file, though reopened and resolved regarding the victim's identity, was ultimately closed as victim recovered, offender. Finding Mia alive was a breakthrough, but it did not mean finding whoever took her in. After more than 20 years, physical traces were gone, direct witnesses could no longer remember accurately, and the individuals once part of Pilgrim's Light had scattered into other communities, making identification of the offender legally impossible. Nevertheless, the most important truth, that Mia had not died, but survived and reunited with her family, allowed the cold case to close its core chapter. For Mia, a stable adult life gradually took shape once the major upheavals subsided. She learned to integrate with the Turner family, maintained appropriate ties with the Coleman family, and built a new life on an identity clearer than ever before. Her adult years stand as proof of human resilience, even when childhood is disrupted and personal identity must be completely rebuilt. Yet, as with every decades-long case, unanswered questions remain. Who took Mia? Did they act alone or on behalf of a group? What was the real motive? Desire for a child, religious belief, personal impulse, or some informal exchange within the nomadic community? And most importantly, did the woman who brought the child to Shreveport know Mia's true identity? These questions leave a large gap in the case history that investigators could not fill, but they have become the basis for experts to continue examining the flaws in 1960s investigative methods, and to stress the importance of never ruling out any lead too early. The legal and social significance of the case extends far beyond Mia's personal story. It underscores that managing missing children requires federal coordination, standardized record-keeping, and readiness to apply new technology at any investigative stage. The case also serves as a warning about communities operating outside administrative oversight, not because they are bad, but because lack of transparency can unintentionally enable harmful acts to go undetected. Through this case, Alabama built foundational improvements in child protection law and cold case procedures. On a deeper level, Mia's story leaves a lasting impact on future generations, reminding us that behind every file is a human life, and every overlooked clue can delay the truth for years. Mia being found alive is not only a victory of DNA technology or investigator persistence, but a symbol that even the slimmest hope can become reality. When the file was officially closed, the story did not end with catching the perpetrator, but with recovering a person, and with the profound lesson that justice lies not only in punishing the guilty, but in restoring identity, truth, and dignity to victims forgotten for years. The Mia Turner story. The 2-year-old who vanished from her Mobile yard in 1965 and was found 22 years later, living as Sarah Coleman, hits very close to American life today, where children can still disappear in one moment of distraction, just like the instant Evelyn looked away to go into the kitchen. The first lesson is, the feeling that the neighborhood is safe and everyone knows each other is never enough to replace vigilance. In present-day America, despite cameras, smart doorbells, and cell phones, the risk remains of children being approached by strangers, extremist religious groups, or informal adoption networks. Pilgrim's Light, moving across state lines without paperwork, shows that if communities do not ask questions when unfamiliar nomadic groups appear with children of unclear origin, that gap can last decades. Second, the story reminds us how crucial early reporting and information retention are. Back in 1965, if the scene had been sealed tighter, if the brown sedan description had been recorded in detail and shared federally, investigators would not have wasted a decade chasing red herrings like the girl in Biloxi or the false confessor. Today, American parents and communities can be more proactive, keep photos and identifying features of their children, understand how the Amber Alert system works, and be ready to cooperate with police, using clear, non-speculative information. Third, the fact that Mia was only found thanks to DNA in the family DNA registry shows the power of science, but also reminds us, don't wait until then to act. If you adopt, or know someone who adopted a child with murky paperwork like the Colemans, encourage them to clarify the process, contact welfare agencies, or even consider DNA testing to protect both the child and themselves. Finally, the way Mia chose to stay connected to both families, the biological Turners and the adoptive Colemans, is a reminder of humanity in complicated stories. Instead of only looking for who was right and who was wrong, what matters more is ensuring the injured person can live a full and honest life. Thank you for joining us on this journey to rediscover Mia Turner's identity, a story that reminds us the truth is always worth searching for. Please subscribe to the channel to keep following cold cases brought to light in future videos.